welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1943 film Tender Comrade. The film centers on the life and experiences of Joe, whose husband Chris has just been deployed overseas. Joe, who works in a defense job at an aircraft factory along with her three friends, pool their resources and move in together to get each other through the war as their husbands are also overseas. We follow their trials and tribulations as they navigate the American home front in 1943. Tender Comrade stars Ginger Rogers as Joe, Robert Ryan as Chris, Ruth Hussey as Barbara, Patricia Collins, Maddie Christians, and Kim Hunter. Tender Comrade was directed by Edward Dmytryk, written by Dalton Trumbo, and produced by David Hempstead.
Except that Henry Kaiser, for his four Kaiser Shipyards, imported a workforce of 98,000 black and white Southerners out of the 5 southern states of Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. These were whites coming off the Dust Bowl and blacks coming up from the slow mechanization of cotton. Everybody recovering from the Great Depression of the 30s. Possible for a black man to be standing on the sidewalk in Jackson, Mississippi, where Southern tradition would demand that he not only not make eye contact with a white person, but that he also step into the gutter if a white person approached. That man could find himself tapped on the shoulder by a Kaiser recruiter and find himself 2 weeks later in the city of Richmond, riding in the front of the bus 10 years before Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama.
That was the voice of Betty Reid Soskin. Betty was a homefront worker who migrated from Louisiana to California for work during the early days of World War II. We'll hear more from Betty later on. The major theme of Tender Comrade was the lives of women living in California, actually the Los Angeles area, during late 1942, early 1943, and how they went about their daily lives amidst rationing, sweethearts being overseas, infidelity, and other very real concerns of the time. While the movie was admittedly, bad, the themes that it brings up are actually interesting and worth talking about. The setting of the film, for one, is entirely appropriate. Before the war, California had seen a fairly significant influx of migrants from other parts of the United States. In the 1930s, California saw a significant influx of people from the states of Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, and Arkansas, states suffering through what became known as the Dust Bowl era. These were workers, generally agricultural workers, seeking jobs, any kind of jobs, in the supposed promised land of California. Work in the state's agricultural industry, movies, construction, or really anything that they could land was an opportunity that they just simply could not theoretically pass up in their states where they had absolutely no work, very little food, and in some cases, very little water. Sadly, the promised land of California wasn't what it was cracked up to be in the late 20s, early 30s, mid to late 30s, really. Jobs weren't any more plentiful there than they had been in the migrants' home states. That would change, however, just a few years later. With the onset of war, and really the period just leading up to the war, as the U.S. got ready for its eventual involvement in the conflict, jobs in California in the defense industry exploded, quite literally. California's already thriving aircraft industry blossomed into a full-fledged powerhouse in the late 1930s, and especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Aircraft manufacturers like Douglas, which, of course, is the plant that is portrayed here in the film, Douglas had plants in El Segundo, Santa Monica, Long Beach. Consolidated, which had plants in San Diego, Hughes Aircraft in Culver City, Lockheed in Burbank, Northrop in Inglewood, and Vultee in Downey, employed hundreds of thousands of workers of all sexes, creeds, and colors. The need for workers was vital. However, just before then, the vast majority of American skilled, just before then, by then I mean Pearl Harbor, the vast majority of skilled workers were men. When the United States entered the war, and really even before the war, when the draft came calling in 1940, those skilled laborers left their factory jobs to wear a different uniform, one of Army OD green, Marine Corps dungarees, or Navy blue. The departure of so many workers left an enormous void in a booming defense industry. Such was the demand for workers that the manufacturers like Douglas recruited workers to fill the jobs left open by men. Recruiting for jobs was an unemployed worker's dream in 1935. But in 1942, it was a reality. A pretty cool stat regarding the unemployment rate and how much things changed so fast is seen by these numbers. Check this out. In 1940, there were 8 million Americans who were unemployed. In 1941, there were 4 million. A year later, in 1942, there was actually a labor shortage. There were more jobs available than there were people to fill them. That's when industry began to turn to women to fill those roles. Women who were told immediately after Pearl Harbor that they had to be skilled workers and were turned away were now recruited to work for the same companies that had initially turned them down. One area of the country that was heavily recruited was the southern United States. People from the southern U.S. flocked to California for jobs. With the promise of good, steady pay, health care, and housing, it wasn't hard to get people who had next to nothing to uproot and move west. People of all colors and creeds moved west, but among the largest group of citizens to migrate were African Americans. African Americans migrated from the south to the west coast in massive numbers. Contrary to popular belief, however, not every woman was a Rosie, as we like to call them now. Not every woman who went to work wielded a rivet gun or filled ammunition belts. One of those who moved west, from my home state here in Louisiana, who did not build airplanes, ships, or fill ammunition belts and was not a Rosie, was Betty Reid Soskin, whom you heard from earlier. In the following oral history clip, you'll hear what Betty has to say about the Great Migration and her role in World War II.
Yeah, I was working for Boilermakers Auxiliary 36. The unions were not yet racially integrated. They wouldn't be for another decade. And so that the unions created auxiliaries, and that's a fancy word for Jim Crow, into which all the black workers were dumped. I came in every day in a carpool. I changed addresses on 3x5 file cards of people who were constantly in motion because everyone was trying to get settled into housing. And I was doing this to save the world for democracy. And as you can see, it worked. It's also true that I had no idea what was happening around me. I never saw a ship under construction. I never saw a ship being launched. I was in a temporary building that was torn down immediately when the war ended. At 20, I was what, maybe 4 years older than you are, 5 years? Wow. I was not much more than a child, certainly slightly out of adolescence. The larger political issues were not a part of my life at the time. I only could see what was around me, and that was that little union hall.
The Kaiser Shipyard that Betty was talking about was a giant in the shipbuilding industry and played an enormous role in the cultural shift in California during the war. Kaiser built 7 massive shipyards, including the one in Richmond that Betty worked for, that employed 150,000 people in Richmond alone. Think about that. Of the 7 shipyards that Kaiser had, 4 were in Richmond. Now, Richmond is a tiny town in California. The tiny town of Richmond and the 4 shipyards that Kaiser built there employed 150,000 people. In 1940, the town of Richmond had a population of just 23,000. Talk about a boomtown. Well, while we heard from Betty, who, as she admits herself, was not a Rosie, the popular image of the kerchief and denim-wearing female worker is not iconic for no reason. While there were millions of women who weren't Rosies, there were even more who were. One of those ladies who did don the denim and kerchief was Rosemary Elfer. Rosemary worked for an aircraft factory here in New Orleans, and in the following oral history clip relates some of her working experiences, why she worked, and where her patriotism came from. Let's hear what she has to say.
So it was 10 hours a day, and we put out a wing it was our part of the plane. We put that out every night, you know. Mm-hmm. It was cargo planes, big cargo. C-47? Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Well, there were a team of 4 of us. It's just a wing where they are, and we had the section of the wing that had all the ailerons, the landing gear, everything there, and so that was harder instead of just a nice sweep like that, it was harder. You had to go in crevices and rivet. We had all kind of buck and bars, but we did a good job. We were a crackerjack team. You had to have your hair tied up. You couldn't have, in those days we did have long hair, but you couldn't have it flowing. You had to have it wrapped up in a kerchief. And of course you had to have, when you were drilling things like that, you had to have goggles or something over your eye, and any infraction of that meant trouble for you. At that time, my two brothers and my sister was in the service. Edwin fought valiantly on Wake Island and was in prison camp. This is what brought the patriotism in the family. We didn't know whether he was living or dead all this time. The Japanese didn't give you any information, so we had no idea. Which made us very patriotic to try and end the war and get him home if he was still alive. And fortunately, he came home. They made me really proud and feeling special for the first time. I just thought I'd put myself any place, nowhere I was needed, and just drifted around more or less, and they sort of made like a heroine out of me, that I did a marvelous thing, and that was important work, and I did important work, and so I made a contribution to society. Oh, I was lucky. The song Rosie the River that came out at just that time that I was there, and everybody was singing it to me. I don't know if you've ever heard Rosie the River, the song. Yeah? I'll sing it to you later.
Okay. Rosemary's brother Irvin, who you heard her mention in the oral history clip, was a Marine who was stationed on Wake Island. He was one of over 400 Marines captured by the Japanese when they captured Wake on December 23, 1941. He remained a prisoner of the Japanese until his liberation in 1945, eventually coming back home to New Orleans. Rosemary was one of an estimated 7 million women who entered the American workforce for the first time during World War II. The pay she was earning was far more than would have been possible for a woman to earn before the war. Frankly, it was far more than anyone with her pre-job skill level would have earned before the war, man or woman. The war brought opportunity to workers all across the country, and especially women. The massive influx of women workers helped to shape and influence American culture and society in ways that we still see and feel today. Just a quick note. In the main episode, I mentioned a book that I referred to heavily in the main episode of Tender Comrade. At the time, I couldn't recall the author. But again, to give credit where credit is due, and I always do that when I can, the book is called The Myth of the Greatest Generation, and it's written by Kenneth D. Rose. It's a fascinating book. It's extremely well written and exhaustively researched. Pick it up. It's certainly worth a read. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Just a quick note that we will be on hiatus for a little bit as we prepare for another new season. We will return the week of July 29th to discuss Mike Nichols' classic film, Catch-22. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and Music Shed Studios here in New Orleans. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.